A really useful tool when you are putting together a story is something that's sometimes called a log line. So you'll hear this a lot, a log line. So a log line is just a short sentence, just a single sentence that summarizes the story concept. So this is the kind of thing that you might say to somebody if they ask you, "Hey, what's that story you're writing about?" Say, "Oh, well, you know, it's about X." You bring out the log line. And the log line has three core elements. So one, it contains the primary characters and possibly the setting. So, it's about, Bob who works in an office. It's about Dirk who, fights some demons. Now, the setting's not named there, but the demons and Dirk are the main characters, the protagonist, antagonist. Typically, you want to name the character in the log line. You name your main character, maybe even name your antagonist, but at least name your main character or characters. Maybe you can refer to them as a group. It's about a group of, mercenaries. Um, Better yet, though, it's about Dan, the mercenary, and, his ragtag group of, whatever, misfits. I hate to say the ragtag misfits thing, but that idea very quickly in the log line, you're summarizing right at the start, who is the story about? And maybe a little bit, depending on how important it is, of where it takes place. So that could be very important, especially if it's unfamiliar. For example, Vlad Dracul in, you know, Wallachia, ancient Wallachia, Elizabeth in Victorian England. The second part of the log line is the most important part, which is a summary, a really quick statement of what is the core conflict that motivates the action of the story. So, we quickly introduce our characters, our primary character, maybe mention a couple of characters, but at least, mention the primary character, maybe mention the setting, and then secondarily, what is the core conflict that is motivating the action? In Victorian England, Elizabeth must, fight to save her sister from dying from tuberculosis, or whatever. What's the core conflict, the core problem that this character has? Once you've stated who we're talking about and maybe when or where we're talking about, what is that person's problem? What is the core thing they're trying to do, and what maybe is stopping them? What's the obstacle? The fundamental, again, conflict that's at stake here. A thing that is worth keeping in mind is that there's different elements of that, but they can be summarized very quickly. That really simple example I gave you, Elizabeth has to stop has to fight for her sister's life against, her tuberculosis infection. Well, a couple of things are happening there. So one, I've named two characters, okay? Elizabeth, and his sister's not an antagonist, or his sister's also a character in here, of course. The thing that is stated in there as well is like what's causing the conflict. So tuberculosis, in this case, is effectively the conflict causing force. Like that's the problem. Her sister has tuberculosis, so inherent in that premise, inherent in that idea, is a couple issues. Without stating them, you can tell a few things are possibly problems here. One is, how does a woman in Victorian England fight for anything, particularly for the health of another woman? Here's a very male-centric, kind of patriarchal society where women just don't have social power. They certainly don't have the respect of a doctor. And so, although I'm not stating it, the setting, the name, And the problem, tuberculosis infection, is in fact supplying a lot of suggestiveness. If I know anything about any of those things in combination, I can kind of see a little bit where the story might go or some of the problems this person might encounter. Of course, when we're talking infection, we're also just simply talking about, how's she going to treat her sister without catching the disease herself. So that's, again, something that's not being stated in the sentence yet, but it is nevertheless, coming through or being suggested by that conflict. The third thing that the logline does, which is something that last example already also did, is give a sense of the story's stakes. What will happen if this person fails? Well, if Elizabeth fails, her sister will die from tuberculosis. So the stakes are very inherent in that particular example. Whatever you're doing here in this single sentence, very short sentence, again, is, my friend Gregory likes to, Gregor Kmichik, sometimes says, somebody wants something, complications ensue. And I think that's a nice, simple way of kind of putting it in some respects. What is sort of the answer to the question of who wants what? Why do they want it? Where are they? What's the problem? Why can't they get what they want? These are sort of questions to think about as you're crafting a logline. Again, it's a very simple, short sentence. You want to try to jazz it up a little bit, make it interesting. But fundamentally, if you get enough detail in there, if you get the three sort of core things in there, if you get, who's the character or the set, the group of characters, and maybe also, where or when are we setting the story? What is the conflict? What's the sort of problem those characters are trying to solve that is driving the action? And what's the stakes? What happens if they fail? If you get those three things into a sentence, then you can say the sentence to somebody and they will know whether or not they want to hear that story. So there's a level at which this logline works in or can constitute to some degree part of an elevator pitch. But you want it to be as compelling as possible, but it being compelling is not the main thing. If you are clear and have that sort of level of detail where these three things are being suggested, then yes, if you can jazz it up and make it as interesting as possible, great. But what sometimes we'll see people doing is they'll try to make it real sexy and interesting, but they won't actually get across the basic information. And so it is sort of coming across as empty speak, kind of marketing talk, rather than really a thing of substance. A story will stand on its own two legs if you just sort of simply and straightforwardly state it, if it is an interesting story. So the key, of course, is how to make it as interesting as possible. The Elizabeth example could be better. For example, I might rewrite it to get into it, some of the sort of gender issues that she's going to, power politics because of her gender in the period that she might be coming into play with. Is it more of a social conflict? It's really like her fighting the medical establishment rather than fighting tuberculosis. That's a question to ask of the idea. It's a question to think about as you kind of are developing the story concept. I might revise that log line to reflect that reality that, maybe what I'm really going to be writing about more is her coming in conflict with these doctors or with her husband or Sarah, I forget her sister's name, her sister's husband, or whatever. I might change tuberculosis to something else, maybe, postpartum depression or some, some other aspect where it's maybe, going to exacerbate the like a psychiatric diagnosis, for example. Or a psychological diagnosis would be maybe more interesting or compelling because there's a period of time where really, men could make up diagnoses for women, and could compel and control them uh, by medicalizing them in particular ways. So, maybe that's going to be a more interesting story that is going to be more particular uh, to the power politics and the gender, issues. What story am I writing? Part of the logline exercise is to figure out as quickly as possible, before you really spend a lot of time uh, actually, writing the story. What exactly is it that you're trying to write? You're sort of taking the idea, you're giving it a form. It's not doing a ton of writing, right? You're only writing one sentence, but you're giving it some form, and you can rewrite that sentence. You can redraft it. You can come at the idea in different ways. You can really hone it to a certain degree and develop it to some degree without having to spend, a ton of time on it. Um, you can really just get a sense of how interested are you in the idea. Because one of the things, of course, that you're going to find as you come up with ideas is some of them are just more interesting than others to you. And if you can't get one sentence that is interesting to you, and it also interests somebody else, it's going to be very hard to write that story. So it is worth really kind of trying to refine the idea, get some clarity around it, find a way to explain it to somebody else before you really delve deeply into the writing. Now, you will, of course, need to come back and refine this thing later on, but it helps to really get as clear as possible up front on what it is that you're trying to do.